in 2013, we started this training program, which is called REPAIR, Restoring Professionalism and Integrity in Research. Turns out that name's a little stigmatizing of our own participants, and we changed it just to PI program, with the P and I standing for Professionalism and Integrity. And it really fit well. So this was a program where we pitched it to NIH saying, you know, we do a lot of research ethics training, and you know, most of it's online. City, you go through your modules quickly, or you do the research and responsible conduct of research ones. And you know, there's just no evidence of effectiveness, and our own lab has even studied that. There just aren't negative outcomes associated with it, so that's good, but there also aren't really clear positive ones associated with it. It also is using this proactive blanket one-size-fits-all approach, right? And what we thought is, actually, people who have real intensive learning needs are people who've actually been into some sort of trouble. So we are serving researchers who've had some sort of lapse in compliance or research integrity. And they're usually cases where it's not so egregious that they were fired, but on the other hand, it's serious enough that either the institution or their funding agency is saying this has got to change. And so what the institution says is, if you want your privileges to do human subjects research or animal research, you have to go to this training. So we've now trained, I don't know, it's over 60 researchers from over 40 institutions. They come from all over the nation. It's a 3-day workshop. I've got a few slides here. I do this all the time. So I'll have slides that give a little bit of detail there. But it's a 3-day workshop. We do pre-assessments. We look at their ethical decision-making or professional decision-making, attitudes toward compliance, professional strengths. So I don't know if you know the Strengths Finder test, but what it does is, from a list of 34 professional strengths, it tells you what your top 5 are. And it's really widely used in industry. I'll say more on that too. And then we test their knowledge of RCR, do the workshop. On the 3rd day of the workshop, they do a professional development plan, and then we do a couple of follow-up coaching calls and post-assessments. All right, so that's in a nutshell here are some of the studies that we've done that gave us some of our data. So the very first one, we've had a couple of projects, an R21 that focused on research violations and an R01 that looked at wrongdoing in medicine. These are usually high-profile published cases. Once we find out who the protagonist is, so to speak, we'll do a thorough lit review. We'll look at 20 to 30 pubs on average, or court records, or whatever. So this is serious wrongdoing we're talking about. And when you're talking about that kind of behavior, it's actually almost always males. A lot of times it's where there's really poor oversight or a lack of oversight. You do start to see a lot of evidence. About 50% of the cases, the wrongdoer, there's clear evidence of I should say, as far as we can tell, pretty strong evidence of a personality disorder, like evidence of criminal behavior outside of their professional life, and no remorse when they've inflicted serious harm and they keep repeating it. And this is so different from the people who come into our training program. You know, these are the people who are typically fired following wrongdoing when they're caught. You know, it's much more kind of a criminological study, and very different from the rest of the stuff I'm going to talk about. So we've also done studies. Now it's over 1,000 NIH-funded researchers looking at their professional decision-making, values, the role of culture, attitudes, knowledge of rules, and this has been really illuminating. And I will say, just over half of the people referred were born internationally. And we talk about that. First, we danced around it, I'd say the first year. And then we had a session where we had 2 investigators from China. And they were both on each other's side, one of them saying, what you did was clearly not plagiarism. But NSF thought it was. And it was just fascinating. And they started talking about culture a whole lot and cultural differences. And, I did my philosophy and experimental site training in Europe. And what I tell people is, it's actually not hard to know the rules of a new country. What is actually really hard is to know how seriously they take those rules. So, like, if you think in the US, there are rules that if you violate them, it's punished severely. Plagiarism is one of those. There are rules where if you violate them, nothing serious happens. That tends to be like authorship rules. So we know there are people who put their names on papers and they haven't read and approved the whole manuscript, right? And then there are rules where if you follow it, and you have to block your ears on this one, you're a jerk, like effort reporting, right? I think if someone were super strict about effort reporting, you'd get colleagues and peers saying you're a jerk, So it's so fascinating, right? Because these are all clear rules, and we teach all of these rules in research ethics courses. But how is someone who comes from another culture supposed to know that we really, really enforce one, we don't enforce the other, and heaven forbid if we enforce this one, right? You know what I mean? It's really culturally complex. So we've looked at that. Yeah.
So do you know what the workforce is in terms of internationals? You said half of your group is, but how do you know? I don't know.
Yeah, I think.
It's across disciplines, right? These are.
Yes. Yeah. So for us, it's anyone really doing empirical funded research. So we don't do humanities scholars or things like that, but we do get psychologists, public health, as well as physicians, biomedical. Yes. Yeah. And I think it's about 25% of PIs are international. Now, when you're talking postdocs, it's closer to 50%. So we're mostly getting PIs, so it's about double the expected rate. Yeah.
And so it is mostly bench scientists?
No, it's pretty mixed.
Oh.
Yeah. But empirical. Yeah. So, and there we did demonstrate, for example, with cultural stuff, when we showed people a list of violations and we said, how wrong do you think this is? We found they distinguished less between, like, plagiarism, falsification of data, and violation of ideals of research, like be generous with your time as a mentor. They didn't distinguish those as much, and they were worse at predicting the views of research integrity officers. So we actually surveyed 100 RIOs to get their views too. And again, it's just showing a perception gap, I think. So it's not just knowing the rules, but also knowing how to navigate them in society. And then one of our most exciting studies, we just finished this about 6 months ago. We interviewed 52 research exemplars. So Allison Antes is someone who got a KO1 in my lab, and these were fantastic interviews. These were people where they were nominated by at least 2 colleagues, or a research administrator and a colleague. And we asked for their CV, we read the nomination letters, we probably had about 100 nominations and picked these 52, really pretty evenly divided biomedical and STEM scientists. And we asked them questions like, how do you run your lab? And we did a survey first, like how many days a week do you work from your lab or near your staff when you're in town. How much do you travel? How many hours do you work a week? A lot of just work habit stuff. How often do you meet with your staff formally versus informally? And then we did, on average, a good solid hour. One of the folks said he had to cut it off in an hour, but would you call me back tomorrow? I'm not done. I've got a lot more I want to share with you. They were fantastic. They were like mentoring the research assistants who were interviewing them, giving them tips, you know. I mean, and that was one of the unforeseen things. Like, we didn't even ask so much about mentoring, but it became apparent immediately these were natural born mentors, or they learned to mentor, but they were so deeply committed to that. And so I'll share a little bit from that. These lab leadership and management best practices, really they came from, I'd say, two sources. Habits that we felt like our PI program participants weren't using enough, and then seeing that these were habits that research exemplars really an awful lot. So here I've got a slide, we put a paper out in Nature about 2 years ago with the first 3 years of participants on why they got in trouble. And we did just a classic root cause analysis. We had our faculty and coordinator get together. We went through the records of each person. We recalled. On day 2, they all share why they were referred and tell their story, and we try to deconstruct it with them and say, you know, why did it really happen and what could you have done differently to avoid it? And, you know, the biggest one by far, so I've told you, a lot of them are really, really good researchers. Was simply lack of attention. And then with the root cause analysis, a lot of times you go, but why? You know? And so a lot of them were overextended, or they were not detail oriented. I want to go back to strengths finders, right? The only two strengths that a majority of our participants had were learner. Not surprising, they all had a doctoral degree, right? They're learners. And achievers. Again, not surprising. You got to be pretty high achieving to make it as a researcher today. There were no other strengths that a majority of them had. And when you look at the strengths that they had, overwhelmingly, they were in this domain called strategic thinking. When you go to the management skills, they were absent. They just weren't there, right? And so it's kind of interesting. We expect a PI, we score every application on innovation. They have to be creative people who can come up with cutting edge questions, right? And in that sense, you think of them more like artists. They're creative sorts. And then we expect them also to have the personality of an accountant, right? As you're doing your effort reporting and your budgeting and you're overseeing your project and you're watching your data. Like, you know what I mean? And it's like, these things don't usually coexist in the same personality. And so, but that is what we demand of PIs. It really is. So, you know, that was the single biggest thing. Another was being unsure of rules. Some of them were very senior researchers, and the regs had changed quite a lot. One of the fellows was laughing. We had a younger person who got in trouble for doing research with select agents. And when the senior guy heard, you know, it was like, oh, the forms weren't filled out to sign out the samples, or they signed it out, but they didn't sign it back in. And, you know, he's like, I'm not kidding. I remember when we had 2-gallon vats of Ebola were pushing down the hall in a gurney because it was too heavy to lift, and we thought this was the safest way to transport it. You're like, oh my gosh, right? Okay, so this guy's, you know, rules have changed since he started doing research. A lot of times a lack of mentoring. I think clinical researchers in particular, physicians often don't get a lot of mentoring. They don't think of themselves as running a lab, you know, for example. not prioritizing compliance, viewing it as just a pain, an obstacle to overcome so they can finally do their work. Relationship problems. This was a big reason why people got referred, was due to relationship problems. Like, the problem had existed for 10 years, might not have been that big, but when there was a relationship problem, that's when the whistle was blown. And, then when they investigate, of course, this is the problem. You might be investigated for one thing, but they're going to look at everything, right? So, the major ones, in poor communication, I know it shows here only 25%, but this is what we could document. We think it's more often than this, that you see problems due to not holding regular meetings or expressing priority. What we're trying to do is, we don't argue with people when they show up and they're like, my IRB this or that. I mean, we shared stories yesterday about IRBs, and they play a very important role. It's a thankless task, right? But we know that not every rule is very reasonable. We don't argue with them about that. We just tell them, look, but, how's it working for you right now? That's so here, we just, what's ironic is sometimes it's exactly the opposite of what people would anticipate with our participants. If you listen to them talk about informed consent, so we've had a few referred for, upon an FDA audit, there were a lot of informed consent forms that were not signed, and they weren't documenting that they'd done the consent process. But when they audited and checked with participants, all the participants said, yeah, I consented to be in the study, and I remember them reading the form to me, right? And so we've had participants say, I take consent way more seriously than most of my colleagues. I try to make sure they understand. I just didn't get the form signed. For God's sakes, no one got hurt. This isn't serious. And why but the fact is, the FDA will shut down a program when you have really persistent non-compliance of that sort. And again, how did they know you did the consent unless it's signed and documented? So, trying to get them to make peace with it. And I guess what I'm saying is sometimes when they think of the consequences and they engage in the ethical reasoning, they're actually thinking about their participants' well-being. They're not thinking about their own well-being, and they're not thinking about their institution's well-being. And to get them to actually broaden things to say, but what's the impact of non-compliance on me and on my institution? That's different from just what's the impact on the participant, which actually could be minimal. No participants harmed by forgetting to sign the form, right? So, like I said, accept it. That's all right, make peace. We're about trying to get them to make peace with compliance. This is just great, I think,
Although I've used this with adolescents, and the inter-item reliability was very low.
Really?
Yeah. But
in a rater or inter-item?
Inter-item. Because when I went over these, I think it's very medically oriented. It's a specific type of study. So I think it's good for a very specific type of study in a specific type of population. But I also think what's interesting, I have found the MacArthur, which you just, and I just want to go into this because if you go to the slide before, there's informed, understanding, appreciation, reasoning, and expressing a choice. And these are not, when you take it out of the exact examples that MacArthur gives, that Applebaum and Grisso give, it's incredibly difficult to distinguish between appreciation and understanding.
Sure it is. Yeah.
And so it's the same thing with the just 0, 1, 2, where who decides what a partial answer is? Who decides what a full answer is? Let's say you have 3 components Do you give it a score of 2 if they only? I mean, I'm really. These are the things that
Yeah,
I'm
yeah, yeah.
with on more sophisticated types of research. And the final thing, which we're going to be talking about in primer, is what is a good reason?
Yeah.
And that is, because I've done research with adults with intellectual disability,
Yeah.
and they are held to a higher standard of reasoning,
Yeah.
especially in treatment, for example. If somebody says, I have a toothache, but I'm afraid of going to the dentist, they don't have to go to the dentist. If you're somebody with an intellectual disability and you say, I have a toothache and I don't want to, you're not competent.
Yeah.
And so, it's very, very difficult. I don't know how you've measured reasoning, but we've really grappled with even how to ask the question so they know we're talking about balancing risks and benefits.
Yeah, yeah.
Because otherwise, what is reasoning to people?
So, I think that is another thing that I do like about this, but I'll circle back, is that in general, it is focused more on just basic understanding of the key elements. But I agree with you, I think it is skewed toward clinical trials. And so, with a lot of research that you're doing, I imagine that it's not a good fit. And maybe it'd be an argument for adapting it for different kinds of studies. To the extent that it gets into reasoning at all and counting reasons, I think there's also, coming out of that same group, a real worry about therapeutic misconception. And so it tries to tap into that a little bit.
That's a good question. The therapeutic misconception is a good question.
And that's what I think.
No.
Yeah, and I think they're trying to get at that. I think their emphasis on reasoning in this test is mostly aimed at avoiding therapeutic misconception. But again, that speaks to the bias toward clinical trials here. I guess the other thing too is, why are you given this, right? So I think for IRBs, a lot of times it's to say, well, if you fall below this threshold, which I think is a 14.5 on theirs, yeah, that's bizarrely specific. But then they don't let you consent. But if you use it more as just a simple consent enhancement tool, right? And I remember the year before you came, Celia, for that, we had a conference series on evidence-based research ethics and mental health. And I remember arguing with Paul Applebaum and a few of these people. I don't think you're assessing decision-making capacity with any of these measures. What you're measuring is the subjective outcome of the consent process. And it could be a bad outcome for a lot of reasons. It could be limited English proficiency. It could be your consent form's 33 pages long and it's a horrible consent process. It could be you're consenting me right after I got a diagnosis and I can't hear anything right now because I'm just freaked out over the diagnosis. It could have to do with so many different things that has nothing to do with my decisional capacity, right?
Or I don't make decisions like you do, Paul.
Right.
And,
Right.
and that's
Right.
Right.
And that's what I find so challenging.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
that it's our decision-making process that we're kind of that's how we do the 0, 1, 2. That's what I find so challenging, is that who decides what a
But
good
I guess what I'm
What's the
getting at,
definition between treatment and research for a typical individual?
yeah.
You're coming in, you're randomizing me, or you're giving me something. I'm going to classes. I'm going to this. How do we? Have we already told them the difference between specifically research versus treatment?
And what if their reason for doing the study is different than your reason for doing the
That's
study,
that's
right?
Yeah.
That's what I
So
get.
what if the
That's
study
what
is
I get.
research on a treatment, right?
Mhm.
But their reason for doing the study is the possibility of getting a treatment.
Right.
Right? They're not doing it because they want to answer, they're not reciting your 3 specific aims, which are your reasons for doing it. They're saying, there's a chance I'll get treatment, or I have
Trans will get a cell phone.
I have a false belief that I will get better care if I do this, even though you've told me not to, but I still want to take that chance.
You guys might think I'm a bad person for sharing this story, but just literally last week in my lab, we're about to do our very first study using an MTurk panel. So that's Amazon.com has this standing panel, and you offer a payment, and people look at surveys, and they can, all right. But, yeah, well, okay, so here's the thing, right? Last time I was at SPSP, the Society for Personality Social Psychology, there were some vendors there that create survey panels, and one of them says, we're so much more ethical than MTurk because we ensure that I think, honestly, one of the big differences, though, is it's more these practices. They don't have good work habits. And, these things here of holding a regular meeting with your research staff, it's just crucial. And again, so Alice and Antes, who I mentioned earlier, we did the exemplar study together. A study we did to just get preliminary data for her K was interview 30 NIH-funded genetic researchers. And we asked them, other than research skills, what skills do you think you need to really run your lab successfully? And it was just loud and clear. All of them saying, we have never had any training on how to manage personnel, how to manage budgets. We're just thrown into the deep end. I had to learn it the hard way. I had to learn through mistakes, take my, blows, and we don't get a lot of training in that, right? And I did not enjoy it, but I was a department chair for 5 years, and I realized that was the best preparation to become a principal investigator, because you learn leadership and management skills, and I apply those department chair skills every day in my lab. And it's just bizarre, but it's true, Normal bit, I wanted to really leave time, though, to talk through, your questions on running a lab, some of these habits, what looks feasible, what doesn't look feasible, what makes you nervous with your own research, when you're honest about yourself, where do you think you might be at risk, and, and brainstorm constructively, what could you do to avoid these sorts of